democratic renewal, a re-establishment of a Scottish Parliament after all those years of union, and really a new dawn.
The opening words of our founding statute, there shall be a Scottish Parliament.
Passed by the UK Parliament without consent. It does somewhat expose the Scottish Government more to decisions made by the UK Government over which it has no control or no influence. So if you don't want complexity, then you don't have devolution.
Right folks, welcome back to Public Knowledge. If you, like me, have ever felt confused about the way this country is run, how it works, then this is the podcast for you. Because we're on a mission to uncover the deals and relationships that are shaping the country we find ourselves in today, and for better or worse, the kind of country we could find ourselves in tomorrow. We're breaking down the big stuff and making it make sense, one episode at a time. Now, in today's episode, we're taking a look at the history of the Scottish Parliament, the weakest link undermining it, and the small window of time we have to renew it. We're joined by one of the top experts in this field, someone so knowledgeable and so experienced, yet so grounded. None other than Professor Nicola McEwen. So for the listeners, just consider this the top highlights. You're a renowned expert in political science. You're a professor of public policy and governance and director of the Centre for Public Policy at Glasgow University. You're a founding co-director of the Centre on Constitutional Change. You're a senior research fellow at the think tank UK in a Changing Europe, and you're the author of countless publications. But we're incredibly fortunate to have you here today to really unpack Scottish devolution for us, the settlement, its history, the current status and current relationship between the centres of power in Westminster and in Holyrood. So welcome.
Thank you for having me.
So let's dive in. I'm going to set the scene. We had the Scottish Parliament opening in 1999 and Donald Dewar was the first Minister of Scotland. I'm just going to read a couple of excerpts from his opening speech. This mace is a symbol of the great democratic traditions from which we draw our inspiration and our strength. At its head are inscribed the opening words of our founding statute. There shall be a Scottish Parliament. Through long years, those words were first a hope, then a belief, then a promise. Now they are a reality. This is a moment anchored in our history. Today we look forward to the time when this moment will be seen as a turning point, the day when democracy was renewed in Scotland, when we revitalised our place in this, our United Kingdom. We are fallible, we will make mistakes, but we will never lose sight of what brought us here, the striving to do right by the people of Scotland, to respect their priorities, to better their lot, and to contribute to the common weal.
Fine words.
Yeah, incredibly moving words, and a bit embarrassing to admit this, but when I first went back to those in preparation for this podcast, I did get a bit teary, if I'm honest, a bit emotional.
No, he was a wonderful orator, but also I think captured the historic significance of that moment. It had been a long time in coming, and I think that's important to remember. And we talk about devolution a lot in the UK now to mean really quite different things. So I'm sure we'll come on to talk about some of that, but there's a whole programme of devolution being rolled out in England now. It's a very different kind of thing, not just in terms of the powers and the responsibilities, but also, and those words capture this very well, I think, the idea of devolution itself was more about democratic renewal, a re-establishment of a Scottish Parliament after all those years of union, and really a new dawn. I think remembering those democratic foundations is really important to understanding the sense of attachment to the Parliament, the sense of anxiety around some of the challenges that it's been facing of late. And it really does put it on a significantly different footing, I think, from other meanings of devolution as they're applied elsewhere in the UK. It's not a terribly helpful concept to to discuss and to identify all of these really quite different things.
That's really interesting, and I'd really like to get your insights on the process that led up to 99, to the opening of the Scottish Parliament. Like you said, it was a long time coming.
Yes, so depends on how far you want to go back. So there was, a very, very long, decades long, centuries long, arguably, Home Rule movement, what we maybe call a Home Rule movement, or a movement for some sort of self-government for Scotland, that sometimes was on the fringes of politics, but really from the sort of late 1960s, 1970s onwards was a significant force in Scottish politics. We saw that come to heights in the 1970s, particularly when the Scottish National Party first really broke through into Westminster parliamentary politics, provoking the other parties, and in particular the Labour Party, to revisit an historic commitment that it had and had since abandoned to a Scottish Parliament. That led to a referendum in 1979, which did not succeed, although there was a majority. It was not a sufficient majority under the rules that were set at that time. But really, I think what led to the very strong support for the Scottish Parliament in the next referendum, which was in 1997, was that period in between 1979 and 1997, when you had a period of dominance of the Conservative Party in England and in the governance of the UK, so successive Conservative governments, often quite radical governments, particularly those that were led by Mrs Thatcher. And that sense that the United Kingdom, as it was then configured, couldn't accommodate the distinctive preferences that were consistently being expressed within Scotland for a different kind of government. So the talk at that time was then there was a democratic deficit that needed to be resolved in some way, and the establishment of the Scottish Parliament was the way to resolve that. So it was about bringing democracy to Scotland, allowing Scottish voters to vote for a government of their choosing over the areas for which it had the new Parliament was going to have responsibility.
So the Home Rule movement predated the nationalist breakthrough, and it wasn't just promoted by nationalists. Is that what you're saying?
Yes. So, I mean, historically, when the Labour Party was born, it was born with a commitment to Home Rule for Scotland, and indeed for the other nations as well. That was abandoned later on, as it focused more on capturing power at the centre in order to access the levers of power to achieve the social and economic goals that it wanted to achieve. But there were also cross-party movements for Home Rule, particularly around at the time of 1940s, if you want to go back that far. Liberal Democrats, the forerunners to the Liberal Democrats, the Liberal Party, it was also always a party that favoured Home Rule as well. So yeah, it's not just about the SNP, but it is also true to say that when the SNP was successful electorally, either in winning seats or in threatening to win seats, that did tend to raise the issue of constitutional policy and a Scottish Parliament higher up the political agenda of the other parties.
Yeah. And I was listening to an episode of the Holyrood Sources podcast recently where they were discussing the death of the late First Minister Alex Salmond, and Andy McKeever, one of the co-hosts of that podcast, said, "Where is Salmond's legacy? We are living that legacy today." And I thought that was a really profound point, actually, because, you know, it speaks to what you're saying regarding the rise of the SNP and the pressure that ended up putting on the different parties to set up the commissions that have then devolved more power to the Scottish Parliament. Does that seem fair to you?
Yes, I think it does. Not just about Alex Salmond as an individual, but if we even go back to the 1980s when a body called the Scottish Constitutional Convention, which was cross-party but didn't include the SNP at that time. The SNP objected to the convention excluding independence as one of the options. Labour and the Liberal Democrats and a broad swathes of civil society in Scotland came together to work on a blueprint for what would become the Scottish Parliament. But the Labour Party was prompted to join that by the pressures from the SNP at that time, by defeat in a very famous by-election in Govan. You can then look to more recent times and see that when the SNP was elected into power in 2007, that prompted the establishment of a commission called the Calman Commission, which first recommended additional tax powers for Scotland, and then the independence referendum itself in 2014 prompted the other parties to make new commitments, the infamous vow that would lead to the Smith Commission and to the most recent revision of the Devolution settlement with more powers again. So there's definitely a relationship there.
So talk us through then the different iterations of power that the Scottish Parliament and then subsequently the Scottish Government has had. As you've just laid out, that's developed since 1999. We've had a couple of iterations. Tell us, how did that start? What powers were there? And take us from there.
So most of the powers of the Scottish Parliament when it was founded in 1999 matched the responsibilities that the old Scottish Office had had. Now, the Scottish Office was a territorial department, a ministry of the UK government, and it had responsibility for administering public policy within Scotland, implementing laws that were passed in the UK Parliament for Scotland. And there were quite a lot of those, not least because Scotland's always had a distinctive legal system, so even if there were broad similarities in the laws, often they had to be made separately for Scotland. But also there were innovations and there were distinctions all the way through the period prior to devolution, and the Scottish Office administered all of that. So the powers that the Parliament was given to begin with largely mirrored those responsibilities, but it brought law-making powers. So rather than previously having to put those laws through the UK Parliament, of which there wouldn't be very much space and time to do that, then there was a Parliament that could decide for itself to legislate for Scotland in those areas.
And the areas, could you break down the areas for the
broadly domestic policy, so education, health, housing, most areas of justice like policing, land, environment, agriculture, fisheries, those sorts of things. So really most policies in the domestic sphere. The big ones that you might think of as domestic policy that were not part of that would be social security and most areas of energy policy and most areas of tax policy. The addition in 1999, which had been a separate question in the devolution referendum in 1997, was tax varying powers. The tax varying powers at that time were so limited. It was a sort of ability to vary the basic rate of income tax by plus or minus three points. And that was never used. It was not particularly redistributive and it was never used. So what the main significance of the Parliament when it was established was it brought democratic accountability to public policy made for Scotland, and it brought the ability to make laws, a much greater ability to make laws in the Scottish Parliament itself.
Yeah, and then there was the subsequent commissions that then increased those powers.
So the Calman Commission that I mentioned previously, that led to a New Scotland Act in 2012 that was principally about tax. And the main motivation there was to increase accountability for spending. With devolution, when it was set up, most of the budget came in the form of the block grant from the Treasury. It's not a gift, it's just that revenues are raised centrally and then distributed out to the various departments and to the devolved governments on the basis of a formula-based calculation. And then the Scottish Government had complete spending autonomy, essentially, to do what it wanted with that budget. And there was some anxiety that some of the decisions they were taking were leading to significant areas of divergence in public service provision in different parts of the UK. In the Calman Commission, one of the main points of emphasis within that commission was to encourage greater accountability for spending decisions by placing more responsibility on the Scottish Government to raise its own revenues. So it introduced some additional tax powers and obligations. They had to raise some revenue. That didn't last very long because we had the 2014 independence referendum, and then that was swiftly followed by the Smith Commission that led eventually to the latest iteration of the Devolution settlement in 2016. And that was quite a significant increase in the powers of the Scottish Parliament, particularly around income tax and not insignificant areas of social security.
And for the listeners, don't worry, we're having a whole other episode on the fiscal situation as well and that context, because that's a lot to break down too. So we'll be going back to that. But also in another episode of Public Knowledge, I've interviewed Liz Lloyd, who was the former Chief of Staff to Nicola Sturgeon. Now, one thing she mentioned was that these commissions, the result of them was often a bit of a political fudge, a political compromise. And so what we've been left with in terms of the distribution of powers between Westminster and Holyrood is just a bit of a mess. I mean, what would you say to that?
So the Smith Commission that was set up after the referendum, I'm not sure it was really a commission in the sense that we normally understand it. It was a process chaired admirably by Lord Smith, but essentially was about finding a cross-party compromise. So all of the political parties were around the table, which in itself is interesting, but there was very little engagement beyond that room. And they took about 6 weeks to come up with the compromise position that was then translated into law by UK law officers. And I said earlier that did lead to a significant increase in the powers of the Scottish Parliament, and that is true. But it also led to an increase in the complexity of devolution. So it meant that the division between those powers that are reserved to the UK Parliament, which is we have a reserved powers model, so the model of devolution is such that what is reserved to the UK Parliament is beyond the competence of the Scottish Parliament, and everything else is devolved. And the way that the current settlement, the 2016 settlement, operates is that the boundaries between reserved and devolved policy areas are a lot fuzzier now. So take tax policy, for example. The Scottish Parliament now is responsible, or the Scottish Government is responsible for setting the rates and band thresholds for all income taxpayers on their earned income for those who live in Scotland. That's a lot. That's a big responsibility. But income tax policy itself is not devolved. The rules and regulations around income tax policy is reserved. Income tax on unearned income, on savings and pensions, that kind of thing, that is all reserved. The personal allowance is reserved. So any changes in those reserved areas can have a significant knock-on effect to the Scottish Government budget. So it's the interdependence is greater, even though the powers and the autonomy is also greater. It does somewhat expose the Scottish Government more to decisions made by the UK Government over which it has no control or no influence. So it does make the relationships between the two governments all the more important. And that has become even more amplified because of the other big development since then, and that is Brexit.
I mean, I think we should, we should start moving on to that relationship because, wow. But just before we move on from here, I mean, I think that's the thing that really worries me. How are we meant to have accountability? How are we meant to, as citizens or as businesses or organisations, to try to engage for particular outcomes or hold the governments accountable for the outcomes that we're finding ourselves lumped with in many respects? Because it does feel very complex and such a mess. And, you know, I just was speaking to somebody who for a long time worked in UK government on these issues. And I was just saying, look, is it just me? I joined the Department for Constitutional Affairs, you know, almost 2 decades ago. I was a constitutional geek and I love this stuff. And, you know, I've not massively engaged with it since, admittedly, but I was saying, is it just me or does everybody else understand this? And he said probably around a handful, about 100, 150 people maybe in the whole country might actually be able to disentangle for you what this means. And I just thought, wow, what a democratic deficit.
So for me, there is a difference between complexity and a mess. So if you don't want complexity, then you don't have devolution. You have a single government and a single centre of power, and you know who makes the decisions and you hold them to account. But if you want to allow for something different from that, and if you want to allow for diversity in the preferences and the governing of these islands, if you like, then you have to have complexity in there. And it was always going to be the case that unless you go to independence, right? So your non-complex outcomes, and even then they're not void of complexity, but in constitutional terms, the cleanest, if you like, outcomes are no parliament at all or independence. Everything else in between that has shades more complexity. And the more you move on from the original devolution settlement, which had, as I said, essentially been mapped onto what was already there administratively, the more you start to unpack those reserved powers and increase the autonomy of the Scottish Parliament, inevitably you will have more complexity there. That in itself to me does not seem to be problematic. It becomes problematic if you don't then adjust the system of government and the system of intergovernmental relations that needs to be an effective apparatus for that complexity. And I don't think we quite got there. And even if we did get there, the other, and going back to your accountability point, the other big problem here is that all of that lacks transparency. So from a voter perspective or a citizen perspective, you need to know who's taking decisions and where the compromises are being made and who's essentially holding the responsibility for something, including in that intergovernmental space. And we don't have sufficient transparency in intergovernmental relations at the moment, and that is a problem.
First of all, thank you so much for unpacking the point around complexity and a mess, because I think that's absolutely important. And sometimes in headlines and short clips for news reports, we do want to be able to say it's simple when actually things have to be complex, as you say, in a complex system. So thank you for that. When you're talking about the developments that are needed, though, to catch up with that complexity, you've talked about intergovernmental relations, which I'd love to move on to next. Is there something also in terms of how the Scottish Parliament is even set up as a single chamber? It was set up with that particular formation for the particular powers that it was given in 1999. Is there something in there about how that needs to evolve as there are greater areas of responsibility? Is there something about a second chamber? What are your views on that?
So this comes up quite a lot, where there are many people who advocate some sort of second chamber, revising chamber. I'm not wholly convinced of the need for that, nor am I, strongly opposed to it. I don't have a strong view one way or the other, to be perfectly honest with you. What I would like to see, and this is not a popular view, is that I think there needs to be more MSPs, because as the responsibilities increase, then the workload of those MSPs is so great that that in itself can be a challenge to their ability to become, expert in particular areas, or to really invest heavily in the committee work that helps them to hold government to account. Nobody's going to win any plaudits by saying we need more politicians. I'm not trying to win any plaudits from anybody anyway, so I don't care.
Well, you should do, but yeah, go on.
But I think so. I mean, there's always an issue around are the committees strong enough, or sometimes they will divide along party lines, or members will feel like they're being whipped one way or another, and that kind of detracts from the independence that you would like the committees to have more in their role. And sometimes that can be very dependent on the skills of the chair. But because of the numbers of parliamentarians just now, there's not really enough for members to aspire to building a career as a parliamentarian and that being the end goal in and of itself. And yeah, I think that is the one thing that I would really like to see bolstered. Revising chamber does raise all sorts of other issues about, you know, is it appointed, is it elected? If it's elected, what is the balance of power between it and the MSPs? And then you would have more politicians anyway, right? So maybe the easier answer is just to have them all in the same chamber.
I heard someone say equally that it was an unpopular view was to have fewer of them and to pay them more.
Yeah, I mean, I'm never convinced by the pay argument. Being a member of parliament is a decent salary. I don't see the logic in saying if you pay them more, you will get better candidates. I don't think pay is the driver for anyone going into politics, nor should it be. Public service is the driver, surely.
So moving on to then this intergovernmental relationship, it would be so interesting to give the viewers, the listeners, a sense of how that has developed over time, because obviously when we had the Parliament, the Scottish Parliament being established in 1999, we had Labour First Minister in Scotland and we had Labour government down south. Arguably there were tensions even then, but yeah, can you walk us through how that's evolved?
Sure. So maybe I'll take a step back first of all and say that in every country that has a system of multi-layered government or multi-sphered government, if you like, there is always some need to have a mechanism for bringing the governments together. So in political science terms, we talk about the distinction between self-rule and shared rule, and self-rule being about the autonomous powers, self-government, the powers of the Scottish Parliament in this case, and shared rule being about the ability of the devolved government to engage with the UK government over those areas where they don't have control but that have an impact on them. So the areas where devolved and reserved powers rub up against each other. And in every country that has multi-level government, you have processes of shared rule, often in the intergovernmental space. And it has always been the weak link of devolution in the UK. And I think partly that's because of the history that we talked about at the very beginning, partly because there was this sort of decades-long drive to bring power to Scotland, to establish a self-governing parliament. And the big emphasis for everybody was on the powers that parliament could do. There was very little attention paid to what happens when you get the limits of that and you run up against the things it can't do and the intersecting jagged edges. And in the first two sessions of Parliament, when the government's Labour Liberal Democrat coalition in Scotland, Labour-led governments in Wales and the Labour government in the UK, there wasn't really much perceived need to address that, partly because of the way that devolution was designed. It was a relatively clear, clean split. There was enough to do within the areas that were devolved without really worrying too much about the intersection, and because they were broadly colleagues. So, you know, where there were difficulties, it was easy enough to pick up the phone to people that you knew from your own party, rather than to try and address it through formal channels. There were some issues, but there weren't that many, to be honest. And of course, when the SNP was elected and you had, first of all, a Labour government, then a Conservative Liberal Democrat coalition in the UK, and then a Conservative government, you have fewer back channels through party links, and you have no choice but to go through the formal links. You then have an SNP government who is more willing to push at the boundaries of devolution than its predecessors were, so more likelihood of coming up against those sorts of intersections and tensions perhaps. But also the changes, as we've talked about, the changes to a more complex system of devolution, also increasing the need to manage that interface between reserved and devolved powers. Layer on top of all of that, Brexit. And Brexit becomes hugely important, transformative in the operation and functioning of devolution, and also the principles surrounding devolution and the approach to devolution of certainly the previous UK government. So when we talked at the very beginning about what were the powers of devolution in 1999, a lot of those things I mentioned, particularly around environment, fisheries, agriculture, these sorts of things, a lot of that was also policies that were Europeanised, so where there were EU laws in all of those areas too. And where there were EU laws, then the Scottish Parliament, the Welsh Legislature, the UK Parliament were all in alignment with EU law, because EU law had supremacy. Now, that didn't mean there couldn't be any differences, but it meant broadly they were in alignment. Once the UK took the decision to leave the European Union and crucially leave the EU single market, then you removed what you might think of as a scaffolding that nobody really realised was around devolution at the time, but you removed that, and that sort of introduced some new challenges or some concerns about what would happen with devolution within the UK without that scaffolding. So all of the governments worked together to develop what are called common frameworks. So these are they first of all explored whether or not you needed some sort of common framework architecture to replace EU law. And for the most part, actually, they decided you didn't. But there were around 30 areas where they decided that there needed to be some sort of process in these particular policy areas, like food labelling or hygiene, waste, recycling, that sort of thing. You needed to have some way of cooperating and coordinating potentially together as different administrations within the UK. So that in itself led to an intensification of intergovernmental relations. But the UK government had greater concerns and then introduced legislation that brought new limits to what devolved governments and devolved parliaments could do with their lawmaking powers. And it all gets even more complex as a result of that.
And you're referring there to the Internal Markets Act, I presume?
In part, yes, I am. So the United Kingdom Internal Market Act was passed in 2020, and essentially it introduces market access principles which are designed to ensure that businesses do not face any barriers to trade when they are trading across the UK. So the most significant of the principles there is around mutual recognition, and what that means is that if a business, say in England, is regulated under a piece of law that is passed by the UK Parliament and applied only in England, then that is sufficient to enable it to trade anywhere in, well, I say the UK, but actually anywhere in England, Scotland or Wales. Northern Ireland's a little bit different because of the protocol and the particular Brexit arrangements there. Now, that all sounds very reasonable, and of course, if you're a business, you would want to have unrestricted trade. But if you are a devolved parliament and you are trying to pass an ambitious law around environmental legislation, for example, you want to promote the circular economy and you want to have compliance around particular rules or regulations that would help you promote the circular economy, then you can't really do that anymore because of these market access principles unless you get an exemption from the Act. So the reason you can't really do it is because you can't force compliance of your own rules to traders who are entering the devolved market from elsewhere in the UK.
The most prominent example of that was the deposit return scheme that fell victim to this. And I co-hosted an episode of the BBC Radio 4's flagship environment programme looking at that and spoke to many small businesses in Scotland who were incredibly worried about the competitive disadvantage that they would face because the United Kingdom, or certainly Scotland, England and Wales, were not acting together on that. It does seem reasonable, in the sense of the economic prosperity, helping businesses flourish, then it does make sense. But like you've pointed out there, it does encroach on the devolved Parliament's powers. But I wonder, the question I have is that surely if we were still part of the EU, you would have that anyway. So the devolved administrations wouldn't be able to just pass laws that would restrict trade or movement of goods in any case. So why is this different, and why is this causing more distress?
So if we were still part of the EU, there would be an EU directive on this, which would require certain things, but not necessarily dictate exactly how you do it. So whether or not you include glass, right? So that's in some EU schemes, but not in others. And as long as you're complying with the EU directive, then you would be able to innovate and do things differently. And that was always the case. And that's why things were not uniform while we were in the EU. So it is true to say that the Scottish Parliament could have proceeded with its deposit return scheme, including glass. But what they didn't get was an exemption from the United Kingdom Internal Market Act to allow them to then ensure that those rules were applied to the drinks industry wherever they originated. And that would have, not really achieved the objective that they wanted to achieve, because you would be really only a limited number of traders, but also put local businesses at a competitive disadvantage. And that's why they decided not to proceed. Now, to take this sort of business perspective, if you oppose diversity and divergence because it will increase compliance costs, for example, then the logical extension of that could be that you would just prefer uniformity because it just makes life easier. Then you don't have devolution. The flip side, and one of the strengths and advantages that was always attached to devolution, was that it increases the scope for innovation. So if you try things out on a smaller scale, then there is the potential for everybody to learn and to either adopt something or adapt something or decide against something because you've seen how it's been developed and deployed in one smaller area. And we've had multiple examples of devolution as a laboratory of policy in that sense as well. So it is complicated. The EU, so the other difference with the EU is that the EU internal market rules do have lots of, the market access principles that we have around mutual recognition and non-discrimination are taken straight out of EU internal market law. But the EU internal market allows for a lot more exemptions because they recognise the legitimacy of making public policy choices, for example, for environmental or cultural policy goals. The UK Internal Market Act is very restrictive in that sense. There are very, very few exemptions that are permitted, unless you go through that intergovernmental process of seeking an exemption, which is ultimately in the hands of the UK government at the moment to determine. The other big, huge controversy around the UK Internal Market Act, and there are other examples of this too, is that it was passed by the UK Parliament, including making changes to devolved matters and devolved powers without consent. So without the consent of the Scottish Parliament, without the consent of Senath Cymru. And that's consent principle that we often talk about as the Sewell Convention. That was a really, really important convention at the very beginning of devolution that said that, yes, devolution, having parliaments in Scotland and having what was then an assembly in Wales, it doesn't change Westminster parliamentary sovereignty. The UK Parliament remains sovereign, but by convention, it will not act on that sovereignty in areas of devolved matters without the consent. And that was recognition of all of the stuff we talked about at the beginning, of the democratic foundations of these new institutions. And since 2016, been something of a pattern of setting aside that convention and legislating without consent. The UK Internal Market Act was the most controversial of those because it was the one that most significantly affected devolved powers.
The way that you put that is quite profound to the point that it's the difference between the EU legislation and the UK legislation was the fact of the recognition of the legitimacy of the public policy choices of the different legislators. So we have seen, you've pointed to it there, this sort of escalation of tensions in a way with the UK government, as you've said, not seeking consent for a whole array of legislation. But we've also seen on the other side, the Scottish government pushing at the boundaries of devolved competence too. Do you think that was a product of the politics at the time, the political relationships? They weren't particularly constructive, were they, between the First Minister of Scotland, Nicola Sturgeon, and the various Conservative prime ministers that we've had? Or do you think it was a much more fundamental point about the mechanics of engagement and the mechanics of the intergovernmental relationships that we have in place?
So I think for any SNP government, they have ambitions for Scotland to be independent, right? And they will want to maximise the policy-making discretion of the Scottish government. So they may sort of see how far they can go within devolved powers and try to always make the case for strengthening the powers of the Scottish Parliament. That's SNP philosophy, to do that. And that's not new. So it's true to say that the relationships were strained. I think Brexit is a very big part of that too. The UK decision to leave the European Union was such a massive constitutional decision in the history of the United Kingdom, and it was one that was not supported by the majority in Scotland. And so that, thinking of, consent and voice and all of these things, that's pretty major. And I think that conditioned some of the relationships between the two governments. And of course it brought the independence issue back to the table for a while, at least. And the then First Minister Nicola Sturgeon reintroduced the idea of a new independence referendum on the basis that the terms on which Scotland had made the decision in 2014 had now changed because of Brexit. That was always going to create some pushback in the other direction from the UK government, and actually in Boris Johnson in particular, to an extent Theresa May as well, but you had a Conservative government who themselves were pushing back at the boundaries of devolution from the other side. So these were not parliamentarians that were instinctively sympathetic to devolution. Remember the line that Boris Johnson was quoted as saying, of describing devolution as having been a disaster. And so there was a sense that they were not particularly keen to respect the boundaries of devolution either. So you then get that push from both directions, and that's going to create some challenges. But it would be wrong to say that there were no periods of cooperation, because there clearly were. In the early part of COVID, for example, really good experiences of cooperation between the governments. Other periods of COVID more difficult. Some more recent examples around the resettlement of people coming over from Ukraine. Again, another example of positive, practical, pragmatic cooperation when it was needed.
Yeah. And now we've got a new administration in Westminster, in the UK government, and there are signs, it seems, that there's a better relationship developing. How confident do you feel about the intergovernmental relationship going forward? And are there any particular changes you would like to see?
So you're absolutely right, there are signs of change. So we have now a party of government in the UK that was the party that introduced devolution. Now, many of the leading figures in that party now were not part of that. It was a long time ago now. But with one exception, and that's the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster, who was, I think, an advisor to Donald Dewar at the time that devolution was being introduced, and is the key government minister with oversight of the intergovernmental relationship. And also has history with John Swinney. I was just reading this morning about how they both worked in the same restaurant when they were young, washing dishes. Wow. so they'd known each other for a very long time, and personality, that personal relationship, that's so important to making intergovernmental relations work. You shouldn't have to rely on it. You should have systems and processes in place that help anyway. But it really does help when it's a positive personal relationship. So the UK government, Labour government, has talked a lot about resetting intergovernmental relations, and that's recognition that it hasn't been great. It hasn't been as it should be. The SNP government under John Swinney in Scotland has also broadly, positively welcomed the sort of commitment to reset and constructive relationships and so on. So I think it is positive. There is a slight risk that saying there is a reset is not then followed up with doing what would be required to make the reset meaningful and sustainable. So we have, I think, a relatively small window of opportunity to fix some things, to go back to restoring the authority of the Sewell Convention, for example, to go back to the United Kingdom Internal Market Act and see if there is a way to get towards a more consensual approach to some of the real challenges that Brexit has created for devolution, to do these things on a cooperative basis so that you try to get towards consensus. And I say it's a small window because we're not too far from the next election. The devolved elections take place in May 2026. Of course, the unofficial campaign will start way earlier than that, and that's when the parties of government become competitors again. So I think in 6 months' time, we'll have a better idea of whether the reset has materialised in meaningful ways. But certainly the signs are good.
I'm positive that our listeners and viewers will have found all of this incredibly valuable. So thank you so much. I just want to ask one final question, which is, of all the things, either whether we've discussed them or not, what do you think on this issue needs to be public knowledge?
So I am concerned about the complexity of the devolution settlement as it stands, particularly within Scotland, but particularly around tax and social security and the sustainability of the system over the longer term. I think there's not a whole lot of public understanding of that, and I don't blame anybody for that because it is really complex. But in order to be able to understand, for example, why in Scotland there's not really any more room to make significant changes around redistributing income tax anymore, just because of the way the system is designed, and understanding why it's not as simple as raising the higher levels of tax in order to get more revenue, because you probably won't get more revenue because of the way the system is designed.
Thank you so much for tuning into this episode of Public Knowledge. I hope you found it valuable, and there's plenty more where that came from. So make sure you subscribe on YouTube, Apple Podcasts or Spotify, follow us on social media, and do have a think about which 3 people you know who would find this episode valuable, and send it to them. Help us build a critical mass of people bringing public knowledge to light, because some things should never be kept in the dark. Till next time.